There's a place in Alabama where time feels suspended, where the wind whispers through trees that now stand where walls once rose, where silence rests on land that was once filled with voices, laughter, arguments, hope, and power. This place was not always forgotten. Once it was chosen to lead an entire state. This place is Cahawba, and this is not simply a story about a ghost town. It is a story about vision and miscalculation, ambition and consequence, hope and humility. It is the story of how a capital city was born, how it struggled, how it rose again, and how it disappeared. The story of Cahawba begins before Alabama was even officially a state. In 1818, territorial leaders desperately needed a capital site. The region was growing rapidly. New settlers were flooding into what would soon become Alabama, and the territory needed a political center that could represent order, authority, and promise. Surveyors and commissioners scouted the land and made a bold decision. They chose a site at the confluence of two great rivers, the Alabama River and the Cahawba River. This choice was not accidental. In the early 19th century, rivers meant power. Rivers were the highways of America. They carried goods, cotton, people, wealth, and opportunity. So this location seemed perfect. The land was fertile. The scenery was beautiful. The location connected interior Alabama to coastal markets and beyond. It felt like destiny. Town planners laid out streets. Lots were marked and sold. Government buildings were envisioned. And when Alabama officially entered the Union in 1819, Cahawba became the first capital. This new city was supposed to be a symbol of strength, a symbol of legitimacy, a symbol of a rising southern state ready to take its place in the nation. And in the beginning, it worked. People came, and they came with dreams. By 1821, Cahawba already had an estimated 1,000 residents. That was more than Montgomery at the time. This wasn't a campsite or a makeshift government outpost. This was a real city. There were hotels for traveling politicians, doctors to care for families, merchants and bankers managing money and trade, lawyers and judges handling disputes. Even newspapers were printed here, spreading information and shaping opinion. For a brief period, Cahawba wasn't just functioning, it was thriving. The legislature met here. Laws were passed here. Major decisions shaping the future of Alabama happened here. Imagine those streets in the early 1820s. Carriages rolling by, children playing outside newly built homes, well-dressed men in coats and hats discussing policy and politics, women shopping in new stores, preparing to build lives in what they believed was the heart of Alabama's future. Cahawba felt alive, important, permanent, but beneath that optimism, something dangerous was always present. Not an enemy, not a rival city, not even political opposition. The threat was the land itself. Cahawba was beautiful, but it was built in a dangerous place. The city sat low between two rivers, surrounded by floodplain and marshland. The soil was rich, but soft. The water table was high, and the weather in Alabama is not gentle. Every rainy season, anxiety crept in. Water crept into yards. Streets softened into mud. Roads became difficult to travel, and stagnant pools of water began attracting mosquitoes. And in the 1800s, mosquitoes did not simply annoy people. They carried death. They brought fever, disease, illness that struck homes suddenly, violently, and without mercy. But the people of Cahawba tried to believe. They built. They invested. They hoped the worst would not come. Then came 1825. That year, a devastating flood swept through Cahawba. Water surged across the town. Homes were damaged. Businesses struggled. Even the State House, the pride of the city, suffered. It was no longer possible to pretend that Cahawba's ground was stable. Politicians began to worry. Families began to question their safety. Powerful voices began asking, how can a capital city survive if nature threatens to drown it every few years? And here is where politics joined the story. Not everyone had supported Cahawba as the capital from the beginning. Some had always argued it was too risky, too isolated, too unstable. Now they had proof. Arguments reached the legislature. Debates intensified. Pressure grew. And in 1826, just 7 years after being declared the capital, Cahawba lost the title. The capital of Alabama was moved to Tuscaloosa. And with that single decision, Cahawba's fate shifted dramatically. A capital city without a capital loses more than prestige. It loses its heartbeat. Government officials packed their belongings. Political life vanished. Influence disappeared. People who had moved there because Cahawba was the center of everything suddenly found themselves in a city that wasn't the center of anything anymore. Businesses began to fail. Families reconsidered staying. Slowly, people started leaving. Cahawba did not collapse immediately. Cities rarely do, but cracks had formed, and the dream of Cahawba as the shining city of Alabama had been permanently damaged. Yet this was not the end, because Cahawba would not give up so easily, and its story was far from finished. When Cahawba lost its title as capital, many believed that was the end of its story. A city that was supposed to lead had been stripped of its crown. The grand vision seemed broken. The dream seemed over. But history rarely moves in straight lines. Sometimes places that fall rise again. And Cahawba was about to experience something unexpected. Even without being the capital, Cahawba was still in a powerful location. The rivers that once promised political success continued to offer economic opportunity. And in the 1830s and 1840s, something transformed Cahawba into one of the most important economic centers in Alabama. Cotton. In the Deep South, cotton wasn't just a crop. It was power. It was wealth. It was the engine of an entire economy. The rich Black Belt region surrounding Cahawba produced some of the most valuable cotton in the world. Plantations expanded. Profits soared. And cotton needed to move from fields to ports and then across the ocean. Cahawba became a key gateway. Riverboats carried cotton bales from Cahawba to Mobile, and from there to global markets. Warehouses filled with cotton. Merchants prospered. Money returned. The city that had lost its political purpose gained an economic one. Once again, the streets grew lively. Ships arrived along the Alabama River. Workers unloaded supplies and loaded cotton. Merchants shouted. Children played in dusty streets. Families built new lives. By the 1850s, Cahawba was thriving again. Then came a turning point. In 1859, the railroad reached Cahawba. Railroads in the 19th century were like blood vessels for cities. They brought life, speed, connection, and growth. Cahawba felt unstoppable again. By 1860, the population had risen to nearly 2,000. Grand homes stood proudly. Church bells rang. Shops flourished. This was a city that had refused to die. But beneath the prosperity, another truth lived here. Cahawba's growth depended heavily on enslaved African Americans. By 1860, roughly 2/3 of the population consisted of enslaved people. They worked in the cotton fields. They built infrastructure. They served wealthy families. They sustained the economy. The beauty and success of Cahawba existed alongside human suffering, and history was moving toward confrontation. In 1861, the American Civil War began. The promise of Cahawba once again faced uncertainty. In war, nothing remained stable. Railroad tracks that were so proudly laid years earlier were torn up to support the Confederate war effort. Supply lines grew unstable. Trade slowed. Daily life darkened. Families worried. Men left for battle. Fear spread across the South. Then Cahawba was given a dark new role. In 1863, the Confederate government opened a prisoner of war camp in the town. It became known as Cahawba Prison or Castle Morgan. Behind its walls, Union soldiers were held in harsh and overcrowded conditions. Resources were scarce. Diseases spread. Men suffered in the sweltering Alabama heat, surrounded by swampy land and humidity that felt like a living weight. Cahawba, once a place of ambition and hope, was now part of the machinery of war. The city carried pride, fear, conflict, and pain. Then, as the war neared its end, nature struck once again. In 1865, a catastrophic flood hit Cahawba. Water surged over the land. Homes were drowned. Businesses were destroyed. Fields and roads disappeared beneath rising waves. It was as if the land was reminding Cahawba, once again, I was never meant to be controlled. When the Civil War finally ended, Cahawba was bruised, damaged, and vulnerable. And then came another blow. In 1866, the county seat, the last remaining source of administrative importance, was moved from Cahawba to Selma. Twice in its life, Cahawba had been chosen, and twice it had been abandoned. When a city loses purpose, people lose reasons to stay. Families left, stores closed, churches emptied, houses stood quiet. But Cahawba didn't simply empty. It was dismantled, brick by brick. Literally, buildings were torn apart, their materials shipped elsewhere to build new towns and serve new futures. It was like watching a life being disassembled. Homes that once echoed with laughter became piles of timber. Walls that once sheltered families became memories. Neighborhoods turned into open land. By the late 1800s, the echoes of Cahawba had grown faint. By 1900, it was nearly gone. Grass replaced streets. Trees marched forward like soldiers reclaiming territory. Nature wrapped itself around everything people had built. Cahawba was no longer a city. It was a ghost. But ghosts do not exist without stories. And Cahawba's story was not finished, because even in ruin, it remained deeply human. And in ways many do not expect, it would become a symbol of something profound. Resilience, transformation, and the complicated truth of American history. War does not simply end when the fighting stops. When the Civil War concluded in 1865, Cahawba was not simply damaged. It was exhausted. Its economy had been battered. Its infrastructure weakened. Its spirit shaken. And then there was water. Water had always been Cahawba's silent enemy. And in 1865, it returned with vengeance. A massive flood swept across the city. Homes that had already suffered through years of war and uncertainty now faced destruction from nature itself. Water surged across familiar streets. Wooden structures buckled. Brick walls cracked. Fields vanished beneath muddy water. Nature did not care that Cahawba had once been a capital. It did not care that its people had dreamed big. It did not recognize political history or human ambition. It simply followed its own law. And in Cahawba, the law of the land was water. The flood of 1865 was devastating not only physically, but emotionally. For many families, it was the final signal. A city must be more than a memory to survive. It must provide safety, purpose, stability, future. Cahawba could no longer promise any of these. In 1866, just 1 year after the war, another political decision sealed its fate. The county seat of Dallas County was officially moved to Selma. The last remaining symbol of administrative life vanished. Cahawba had now lost everything twice. First, it had lost the state capital. Now, it had lost county power. This was more than bureaucratic paperwork. This was identity. Cities are living organisms. They need function to survive. They need relevance. When function disappears, people leave, and so they did. Families packed their belongings. Merchants shut down stores. Workers sought opportunity elsewhere. Churches echoed with smaller congregations, then fell silent altogether. Within just a few years, many homes stood empty. But Cahawba did not simply decay. It was taken apart, piece by piece, board by board, brick by brick. Some houses were physically moved to other towns. Some were dismantled and sold as building materials. Bricks from Cahawba helped build lives somewhere else. Imagine watching your city being unbuilt, not destroyed in fire, not shattered by bombs, but carefully, methodically undone. It's a quieter tragedy, but no less painful. By the late 19th century, Cahawba had transitioned from a symbol of pride to a memory fading into the trees. Yet even in its decline, Cahawba continued to play an important role, one many people today don't know. Because after the Civil War, as Reconstruction reshaped the American South, Cahawba briefly became something remarkable, a place of political hope. Formerly enslaved African Americans, newly freed but facing immense challenges, gathered in Cahawba to organize, build communities, and push for political voice. The old courthouse, once a monument of state power, now hosted new leadership meetings. For a time, Cahawba became known as a mecca of the radical Republican Party during Reconstruction. In those years, it wasn't just a broken town. It was a meeting ground for courage, for resilience, for a fight to reshape the future. Men who had once lived under slavery now stood where lawmakers had once ruled over them and began working to claim their rights. This chapter of Cahawba's life is seldom spoken about by tourists or casual visitors, but it is vital. Cahawba is not only a story of environmental struggle or political collapse. It is also a story of human strength, of communities who refused to disappear even when the town around them did. But ultimately, Cahawba could not hold on. Economic opportunities shifted elsewhere. Railroads bypassed it. Commerce left. Population dwindled even further. Year by year, nature thickened its presence. Roots pushed through forgotten brick foundations. Thorns wrapped around collapsed doorframes. Moss and vines crawled over whatever remained standing. Silence spread aggressively, the way businesses once had. By 1900, Cahawba was almost completely abandoned. And soon it became something new. Not a capital, not a thriving cotton town, not even a struggling community. It became a ghost. Today, when you walk through old Cahawba Archaeological Park, you do not walk through ruins like ancient Rome or towering medieval fortresses. You walk through suggestion. You see foundations instead of walls, brick fragments instead of buildings, empty land where entire streets once existed. You don't just see history, you feel absence. But absence itself is powerful. You may stand beneath the remains of the original streets. You may look across open fields where grand houses once stood. You may pass silent cemeteries where the people who built Cahawba rest. And in that silence, you hear echoes. You imagine the sound of riverboats arriving, the laughter of children in the 1820s, the speeches of politicians, the cries of prisoners during the war, the determined voices of freed African Americans during Reconstruction, all layered, all intertwined, all part of the same piece of land. In 1973, Cahawba was added to the National Register of Historic Places, recognizing not only its historical importance, but its emotional one. Today, it is preserved as Old Cahawba Archaeological Park. Visitors come from across the country. Some are historians, some are travelers, some are simply curious about what happens when ambition meets reality and loses. But Cahawba is not simply a historical attraction. It is a lesson. It teaches that greatness is fragile. It reminds us that power can vanish. It shows how nature does not negotiate with human dreams. And it tells us that even after disappearance, stories remain. Cahawba is not a failure. It is a reminder of humanity. A reminder that we sometimes build where we should not. That we sometimes believe we can control everything: land, water, politics, fate. But the earth beneath us always has a voice. And in Cahawba, that voice was loudest when everything became quiet. Today, the winds move gently across empty land. Trees sway where crowds once gathered. Birds sing where debates once echoed. Nature has reclaimed what time and history left behind. Yet Cahawba still speaks, not through monuments, but through silence. Not through power, but through memory. It speaks through every cracked brick, through every forgotten corner of its ground, through every visitor who walks slowly and realizes this is not just a ghost town. This is a story about us, about dreams, about loss, about resilience, about humility. Cahawba rose with hope in 1819. It thrived, then struggled. It found rebirth, then faced war. It endured floods. It played a role in freedom and political transformation. And finally, it faded, but it did not disappear completely. Because as long as we tell its story, Cahawba lives, not as a capital, not as a bustling community, but as a whisper of history, reminding us that nothing, not even cities, is guaranteed forever. This is Cahawba, Alabama, the lost capital, the vanished city, and a place where silence tells the truth about time.